Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome back to BQS 552 Construction Technology 4. In this recorded video, we're going to continue deep foundations. In our last lesson, we have learned type of foundation, why we need to use piles as foundation, factors affecting selection of the types of the piles, and the classification of piles, which we include the based on function and based on materials. For today, we're going to finish off this classification of piles, which is based on method of installation. We're going to learn pile accessories, works involved in piling works, and raking piles. The classification of piles based on method of installation, we have 1. The driven piles, 2. The driven and cast in situ piles, 3. Bore and cast in situ piles, and number 4 is screw piles, and last but not least is jack pile. The first method of installation, which is driven piles, this is the most common method. The piles are driven into ground by applying blow with heavy hammer. Timber or steel and precast concrete piles are installed by driving the piles. These are often called driven piles since they are usually driven into the ground, displacing the earth, whether it is outward or downwards, around the pile shaft. Applied of piles which are either driven, jacked, vibrated, or screwed into the ground. There are a variety of driving equipment that can be used in this kind of piles installation. The key components are leads and the hammer. The leads are used to align the hammer to strike the pile squarely. If you look at the illustration here, there is a lead here, that what we call as lead. The double acting hammer is used to increase the number of blows per minute and utilize stream or air to lift the ram and force it down. So this is the example of double acting hammer, the cross section. Hammer can be simply drop hammers of weight between 2.5 and 15 kilonewton, or modern steam or pneumatic hammer. So there are many types of hammer. Two popular types of stream or pneumatic hammers. The single acting hammer utilizes steam or air to lift the ram and its accessories. For example, we have cushions, drive caps, and others. So ini adalah accessories masa kita nak drive the hammer and the piles ke bawah. The next classification of piles based on method of installation is driven and cast in situ piles. The piles are formed by driving a casing with closed bottom, tertutup, into the soil. The case is later filled with concrete. The case may or may not be withdrawn. Jadi sama ada case tu dibiarkan kat dalam ataupun akan dibawa keluar. Driven cast in situ piles use steel or precast concrete driving tubes which are filled with in situ concrete after driving. Selepas dimasuk after di drive di dalam tanah, the steel ataupun precast concrete driving tubes tu akan diisi dengan concrete. Variation of pile lengths can be more easily accommodated using segmental liners. The piles can be cast accurately to the required length and the driving or liner tube can be driven in short length. Jadi mungkin akan dalam segmental pendek-pendek lah. Jadi lebih senang kita nak control the length of the pile. Can be formed economically in diameter of 300 mm to 600 mm with length up to 18 meter. The design to carry loads up to 1,300 kilonewton. It requires heavy piling rigs, an open level site and a site where noise is unrestricted sebab bising. There are two types of driven cast in situ piles, which is one permanent casing and the other one is temporary casing. Driven and cast-in-place piles are installed by driving to the desired penetration a heavy section steel tube with its closed end. Jadi tertutup. A reinforcing cage is next placed in the tube which is filled with concrete. Jadi dia akan isi dengan konkrit. The tube is withdrawn while placing the concrete or after it has been placed. In the other type of piles, thin steel shell or precast concrete shell are driven by means of internal mandrel, and concrete with or without reinforcement is placed in the permanent shells after withdrawing the mandrel. The mandrel is actually macam besi, batang besi yang kita letak dekat dalam shell tu so that dia boleh protect dan maintain the shape of the tube. So shape tube tu tak berubah bila kita drive dia ke dalam tanah. The permanent casing is usually formed with reinforced concrete or steel. The purpose of permanent casing are to consolidate the subsoil using the pile case, to protect the concrete cast inside the lining against weak strata of subsoil that might otherwise fall into the pile excavation. Mungkin dekat keliling tu tanah tu jenis yang soft soil. Jadi kita perlu protect, tak nak tanah tu masuk ke dalam area yang kita nak pile. Protect the green concrete of the pile against static or running water that may erode the concrete, and to protect the concrete against any contamination from the ground. It is suitable for the soil of poor bearing capacity and insaturated soils, maksudnya ada air, where the concrete shell protect the green concrete cast inside them from the static or running water. The first example for permanent casing we have west shell pipe. So ini adalah untuk casing yang permanent, casing yang memang takkan di withdrawn daripada tanah. The installation for west shell pile. First, the concrete pile shells are threaded on a mandrel, the diameter of which slightly smaller than the internal mandrel of the shell element. A steel band acting as a sleeve is installed at each joint. The internal face of each joint band is coated with bitumen to prevent water penetration. Jadi dekat setiap shell tu, sambungan dia kita akan letak sleeve ataupun steel band ni lah untuk sambungan. Finally, a pile shoe is fitted to the lower end of the bottom shell. The whole assembly is then driven into the ground until the required depth is reached. At the required depth, the mandrel is removed. Jadi sebab kita dah masuk kan, dah drive, jadi the protection tu kita remove lah. Withdrawal of the mandrel leave a stable, watertight hollow concrete column at the base which is integral pile shoe. Steel reinforcement in the form of prefabricated cage is placed in the hollow core, which is then filled with the concrete and it is being vibrated. This type of pile is used principally in a soil of poor bearing capacity and insaturated soil, where the concrete shell protect the green concrete cast inside them from static or running water. For temporary casing, we have the example which is the Franke system. For the first stage, a heavy steel casing, jadi ini adalah casing dia, that is expandable steel plate at the end with the plug of dry concrete. The plug of concrete is driven using drop hammer ataupun diesel hammer or vibrating machine. It will expand and grip the side of the casing and takes the bottom casing into the ground. On reaching the required depth, casing is restrained by the cables and the plug of concrete is driven out into the ground to form a bulb at the end of the pipe. This pulp is often increased in size by further batch of dry concrete. Jadi dry concrete ni akan dimasukkan by batch. The hammer is lifted off and a reinforcement cage is lowered. Jadi ini adalah reinforcement cage. Down the full length of the tube. A highly workable self-compacting concrete is then placed in the tube through a hopper, followed by raising the tube by hoist rope operated from the pile frame. The tube may be filled completely with the concrete before it is lifted, or it may be lifted in stages depending on the risk of the concrete jamming in the tube. The second example of temporary casing is fibrocast in situ, driving a lining tube with cast iron shoe into the ground with a diesel hammer or hydraulic hammer operating from the piling rig. This is the iron shoe. Concrete is placed and consolidated by the hammer as the lining tube is withdrawn. The particular application of this type of piles is for piles formed through a substratum so compact as to be incapable of being taken out by drilling. The purpose of the cast iron shoe, which is left in the ground, is to penetrate the compact stratum through which the pile is formed. The third classification of piles based on method of installation is bore and cast in situ piles. The piles are formed by excavating a hole into the ground and then filling it with concrete. Jadi dia lain daripada driven and cast in situ piles. Sebab kalau driven, kita akan drive lah using the percussion ataupun hammer ataupun vibration untuk drive the casing pile tu masuk ke dalam. But kalau bore piles, kita akan excavate dulu, keluarkan tanah, and then baru kita akan form a pile into the ground. For this type of pile, we have the percussion bore pile. These are suitable for both clay or gravel subsoil. The diameter of piles are usually from 300 to 950 mm, and it can carry the loads up to 1500 kN. A hole is bored or drilled by means of earth drills, which withdraws soil from the hole into which the pile is to be cast. Occasionally, it is necessary to lower or drive in steel lining tubes as the soil is taken out. It is to maintain the side of the drill hole. As the pile is cast, the lining tubes are gradually withdrawn. Jadi, tube tu just untuk protect supaya tanah dekat keliling area yang kita bore tu tak masuk ke dalam lubang kita try to buat. Although not common nowadays, some boring can be fixed to tripods rather than a typical track fix. The advantages of such equipment are the piling rigs are light and easily manipulated. Because of the arisings are brought to the surface, a precise analysis of subsoil strata is obtained from the soil withdrawn. A disadvantage of pile cast in the ground is that it is not possible to check that the concrete is adequately compacted and whether there is adequate cover of concrete around the reinforcement. For the percussion bore pile, the method of installation: first, the excavations may be supported by temporary casing or the use of drilling fluids such as water or bentonite slurry. Soil is withdrawn from inside the lining tubes with a cylindrical clay cutter that is dropped into the hole, which bites into and holds the cohesive soil. The cutter is then withdrawn and the soil is knocked out of it, jadi dibuang lah. Coarse grained soil is withdrawn by dropping a shell cutter or bucket into the soil. Soil which is retained on the upward hinge flap is emptied when the cutter is withdrawn. Jadi lepas dia ambil tanah tu, dia akan buang, so that the next process tu akan repeat lagi lah. When it reach the required depth, the reinforcing cage is lowered into tube. Jadi dia akan letak lah reinforcing cage. Concrete is cast under pressure through a steel helmet, which is screwed to the top of the lining tubes. The application of air pressure at once compact the concrete and simultaneously lift the helmets and lining tube as the concrete is compacted. So as you can see, lining tubes ni makin lama makin dia tarik keluar lah. As the lining tubes are withdrawn, protruding sections are unscrewed from the helmet, refixed until the pile is completed. As the concrete cast under pressure, it extends beyond the circumference of the original drilling to fill the compact weak strata and pockets of the soil. Jadi you nampak memang dia tak straight jadi dia akan fill in the pockets of the subsoil. Because of the irregular shape of the surface of the finished pile, it acts mainly as a friction pile to form what is sometimes called a floating foundation. As the pile continues to settle into the soil, the friction forces surrounding the pile will increase. This is the shell cutter. Jadi bila dia potong kan dia ada cutter dekat sini, so dia akan potong the tanah and then the tanah will be masuk ke dalam bucket ataupun shell. Jadi dia akan ditarik keluar. So this is the example of core barrel that trap the excavating granular. So as you can see, there's a hole here yang akan masukkan tanah, and you can see the corrugated here that can be the cutter yang akan potong tanah tu lah. The second type of bore and cast in situ piles, we have the rotary bore piles. It is suitable for most cohesive soils such as clay and is formed using an auger, which may be operated in conjunction with the steel tube liner according to the subsoil condition. It depends by the condition of subsoil. Flat auger is usually mounted on an adapted excavator or crane. For rotary bore pile, usually a tractor-based rig support a diesel engine and crane jib is used. A cable runs from the motor up. The jib support large square drilling rod or caliber that passes through the turntable, which rotates the bar to which is attached a drilling auger. Jadi caliber ni akan bersambung dengan drilling auger. The turning shaft of caliber is generally up to 7.5 meter long. The weight of the rotating caliber causes the auger to drill into the soil. The auger is withdrawn from time to time to clear the excavated soil. Where the subsoil is reasonably compact, the reinforced concrete pile is cast in the pile hole and consolidated around the reinforcing cage. Large diameter bore piles are usually considered to be those over 750 mm and can be formed with diameter up to 2.6 meter with length ranging from 24 meter to 60 meter to carry loadings from 2,500 kilonewton to 8,000 kilonewton. This type of pile is often used on urban sites where a number of piles are to be cast, because it will cause the least vibration to disturb adjacent buildings and create the least noise disturbance. This is the illustration for bore pile with auger for cohesive soil. As you can see, this is the caliber yang disambungkan kepada auger. The illustration here shows that the piling rig with auger and caliber is set into the position. And when it is needed, the board cast in place pile with steel sleeve excavation support untuk elakkan daripada tanah termasuk dalam kawasan yang telah di-auger. This is the auger for cohesive soil and reinforcement cage for pile. So auger ni ada macam-macam jenis Contohnya Cheshire or helix auger ataupun mungkin other fight auger. Jadi normally kita akan korek dulu pakai this auger, and then kita akan masukkan the reinforcement cage, and then baru kita akan pour the concrete inside. The base or toe of the pile can be enlarged or under rim up to 3 times the shaft diameter to increase the bearing capacity of the pile. Compaction of the concrete, which is usually placed by tremie pipes, is generally by gravitational force. Jadi kita tak guna any air pressure jadi dia just masuk pakai gravitational force. Test loading for larger diameter bore pile can be very expensive, and if local authority insists on test loading, it can render this method uneconomic, jadi mahal The installation, first, we need to adjust the piling machine on the pile axis and hold the auger to the drilling place. Jadi kita kena set dia pada the position. Start drilling until the auger is filled. Next, return from the drilling level to the top of the pile hole. Jadi drilling tu akan kita keluarkan daripada pile hole and unload the dirt in the unloading area. Start erecting rebar cage using crane and next start pouring the concrete and finish off the pile. The fourth type of classification of pile based on the method of installation is screw piles. It can be installed quickly with a minimal noise and vibration. The screw piles are wound into the ground, much like screw is wound into wood. It provides effective in-ground performance in range of soil, including earthquake zone and liquefaction potential. Screw piles ni not only limited pada type of steel piles yang macam bentuk screw tu Screw piles are drilled piles, but the soil is displaced and compacted as the auger head is rotated into the ground to form a stable pile shaft, with little soil being removed from the hole. The original system is actually daripada cast in place company Atlas pile in which the special single flat auger head is screwed and jacked into the ground on a thick well steel tube using specially designed rotary high torque rig. The helical shape of the pile shaft produced by screwing in auger flange is maintained as the auger is back screwed to form a stable hole into which the reinforcement cage is placed prior to concreting. Apart from that Atlas pile, other proprietary displacement piles such as screw sole pile by battery Soletange, which produce a helical flange pile shaft in weak soil, and the spire system by SEFI in France for the straight shaft also use specifically shaped augers on the end of the drill tube to compact the soil and inject the concrete. So ini adalah rupa bila screw saw pile ni dikeluarkan excavated. Ini adalah the auger yang digunakan untuk bore lubang pada tanah tu and dia terus masukkan tube dalam tu. Jadi dia akan masukkan konkrit lah dekat dalam. For the next classification of pile based on the method of installation is jack piles. Jack into the ground by applying downward force by a hydraulic jack. Commonly used in underpinning structure. Jadi untuk support structure kita gunakan this hydraulic jack pile. Jack pile are basically displacement pile pushed into the ground by static load. Most of them were installed in granitic saprolites. So ini adalah jenis rock di bawah tanah. A pile jacking machine carries tons of counterweight and is huge in size. It is suitable for sites which fairly large and flat ground. Jack piles can be installed at a distance of 1.3 meter from existing structures. Unlike other piles installed by driving, jack piles have an advantage that they cause little pollution to the environment, such as noise, air, and vibration. The machines for pile jacking can be used for static pile loading tests, but each test occupies the jacking machine for more than 3 days. The installation of jack piles is very slow in process, and particularly when the jacking machine lies idle for cooling of welded joints during the pile splicing, masa disambungkan penyambungan pile tu Next, we look at the pile accessories. One, we have pile helmet and pile shoe. For pile helmet, it is to protect the top pile from blow of the hammer on top. It is usually made of steel, and the thickness and the size is dependent on the shape of size of the pile hammer. When driving precast concrete piles, a helmet is placed over the pile head for the purpose of retaining position, a resilient dolly or cap block that cushion the below the hammer and thus minimizing damages to the pile head. The dolly is placed in a recess in the top of the helmet. Jadi ini adalah gambaran macam mana actually dolly dan pile helmet tu Next, we have pile shoe. It is fitted at the bottom end of the pile to protect the pile and to facilitate easy pile driving. This one I believe that you dah tengok dekat dalam precast concrete piles yang I ada explain in previous slide. Made of cast iron, steel or wrought iron. It has various types and shape. This is the example. There are another works that involve in piling works other than the pile installation, which is one of it is the bearing capacity test. The bearing capacity of piles will depend on, one is the length of the pile, the cross-sectional area of the pile and shear strength of the soil. The bearing capacity ni dia always depends kepada bearing capacity of the soil. Maksudnya capacity of soil tu untuk support the loads applied to the ground, because you akan transfer load daripada foundation tu pergi kepada ground. Sometimes it is necessary to use group of piles rather than a single piles in order to obtain adequate bearing capacity. So for the single piles, to obtain the effective area in contact, pile has to be driven deep. And if you use the group of piles, it will reduce the driven depth and also less displacing of soil. Jadi kalau you pakai group of pile, maksudnya you letaklah pile dalam satu tempat and you put a pile cap on top yang akan sambungkan semua piles ni the connection there. Untuk check the safe bearing capacity of the pile or cluster of piles, it can be established by using the loading test on a trial pile, for example cartilage, which used 2 times of the working load nak check and measuring the set of pile, which is the distance it sinks into the ground under the given number of blows of a hammer or a given weight drop through a given distance. Jadi kita akan test dengan menggunakan hammer. Kita akan blow ataupun drop pada given distance, nak check berapa banyak dia akan turun piles to sink in. Cartilage. The cartilage is used as the reaction system for the hydraulic jack during the load test. Jadi ini adalah test yang kita buat nak check sama ada bearing capacity is okay or not. It may consist of precast concrete blocks, precast concrete piles, cast iron blocks or any heavy dead weight. In all cases, the cartilage should be heavier than the required test load. The cartilage is supported on a timber or other appropriate crib. The cartilage rests on 2 lateral supports wall through a bed of steel beams. So macam inilah rupa cartilage. Nampak beban dekat atas tu. In order not to influence the behavior of test pile, the spacing between the support and the test pile should be not less than 2 meter or 2 times the pile diameter. The total weight of the cartilage should be 10% more than the maximum test load and carefully centered over the test pile. Further, these tests are most expensive and time consuming to perform from the standpoint of setup requirement. Jadi cartilage ni jarang kita gunakan untuk test. Kita lebih gunakan yang that drop hammer tu. So ini sebenarnya adalah cross section cartilage macam mana how it works. So the pulse is actually down here, below here. So kita nak check berapa banyak pile ni akan sink in disebabkan oleh this beban loading yang kita letak ke atas pile ni. In cohesive soil, normally what we do the test is by calculation based on the measured shear strength of the ground at various level. So normally kalau dalam cohesive soil kita akan pakai bore and cast in situ kan. Jadi kita akan mungkin pakai auger ataupun pakai percussion tu. Jadi kita akan collect soil sample untuk kita test. Another bearing capacity test that we can use is measurement of small diameter penetration test. Make use of the cone penetration developed to measure the soil resistance at its foot and the frictional resistance along its outside surfaces. The measurement can be taken at various depths over the building site. The length and bearing capacity of the pile are predetermined before the works begin. Another works that involve in piling works, we have the jetting piles. It may be employed when the frictional resistance at the side of the pile or at the toe creates a very hard driving conditions. So it always depends pada ground condition. So contohnya kalau you nak drive dekat area yang rocky so kita perlukan assistance of jetting. Jetting may be achieved through a single or twin tubes which may be fixed on the side of the pile or cast into the lower part of the piles. Normally kita akan pakai water lah to jet. The illustration shows the jetting of pile, whether we're going to put it in the center of the piles or at the side. Both sides of the piles become it. This one is twin jet tubes. Other than that, the work involved in piling works is stripping the pile head. Jadi kita kena potong lebihan daripada pile tu. The concrete at the head of the piles is stripped to a level that allows 50 mm to 75 mm projection into the pile cap. So kita nak sambungkan dengan pile cap. Pile reinforcement is bent down into position within the pile cap and bonded with the cap reinforcement. Ini adalah pile cap. So this is the pile. Kita nak potong supaya kita boleh sambungkan dengan pile cap. Before stripping commence, a check should be made on the level of the pile to ensure that it has not risen. Piles are subject to rising as a result of ground heave or the driving of adjacent pile. So bila you drive another adjacent pile kat tepi, mungkin piles dekat sebelah pun dia akan tolak ke atas, mungkin disebabkan daripada pressure daripada the driven piles di sebelah ataupun ground heave. Sebab bila ada perubahan tanah ni, tanah bila bergerak disebabkan oleh ground heave, jadi mungkin pile akan terangkat. Now the works that involved in piling works, we have the lengthening of the piles. So, bila kita drive the piles and the piles is not at the level yang kita nak, so kita kena splice, kena sambungkan pile yang lagi satu dekat atas lah. Okay, this can be achieved by one of the following method. First, incorporate multi-bar in the head. It allows normal stripping and welding, ataupun using multi-splicing sleeve to fit over the pile to receive extension pile, ataupun kita drill the pile head and connecting the extension pile by means of dowels and epoxy resin. Actually, there is many method untuk splice kan. So ini adalah contohnya tadi yang kita pakai welding. This is dowel epoxy and this is with the sleeve. By means of a central lining sleeve and 4 locking pins at corners. By means of bayonet type joint, the joint that comprise male and female steel fitting that gives close fit when coupled together. So connector ring ni pun consider as sleeve juga this is bayonet type of joint. Okay, we have extra here, raking piles. Piles can be arranged in a number of ways so that they can support load imposed on them. The vertical piles can be designed to carry vertical loads as well as lateral side loads. If required, vertical piles can be combined with the raking piles, maksudnya piles yang dibuat secara sengit as incline to support horizontal and vertical forces, and this is normally being assembled dekat water untuk piers, for example. So this is the example of the raking pile. So this one is a normal vertical pile. So ini adalah raking pile. Dia akan sengit sikit lah, macam tu, incline, yang boleh resist vertical and horizontal load. I will end this recorded video with the quote from John D. Rockefeller: "The secret of success is to do the common things uncommonly well." Thank you so much, everyone. Have a nice day.